The cold Atlantic doesn't care who you are. At 2 a.m., when the water is black as oil and the wind cuts through steel, it strips away every rank, every medal, every carefully constructed hierarchy. Out here, death comes silent. A sonar ping, a metallic groan, then nothing but freezing darkness rushing in. On the night of March 17th, 1943, Convoy HX-229 was crossing the killing zone, the mid-Atlantic gap where U-boats hunted without mercy. 300 men held their breath as depth charges thundered in the distance, each explosion a grim reminder that invisible predators circled below. Officers stood rigid on the bridge, sailors gripped their stations, and somewhere deep in the belly of the HMS Starling, a man nobody noticed was about to change everything. His name was Thomas Wilkins. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't an officer. He wasn't even a proper sailor. He was a cook, a 32-year-old man with grease under his fingernails and flour in his hair, dismissed by everyone who outranked him, which was everyone. The officers called his idea insane, dangerous, the rambling fantasy of an exhausted mind that had spent too long in the galley heat. They nearly threw him out of the wardroom for even suggesting it. But that insane idea, born from rattling pots and banging pipes, would save more lives than any torpedo ever took. This is the story of the man who changed the Battle of the Atlantic with nothing but noise, stubbornness, and a refusal to stay invisible. Thomas woke every morning at 4:30 to the same routine. The ship's galley was his entire world, a cramped metal cave that smelled of boiled cabbage, engine oil, and sweat. Steam rose from industrial pots like fog off the Scottish Highlands. The floor was always slick, the walls always trembling with the ship's engines. He moved through this space like a ghost, unnoticed and unseen. When sailors came for breakfast, they looked through him. When officers collected their coffee, they didn't say thank you. He was furniture, a necessity, as invisible as the pipes running through the walls. But Thomas didn't mind the invisibility. In some ways, he preferred it. Being nobody meant you could watch everything, and Thomas watched. He noticed patterns. He noticed when the ship's rhythm changed, when vibrations traveled differently through the hull, when certain sounds made the hanging pots swing in particular ways. His hands were always busy, chopping, stirring, cleaning, but his mind was elsewhere, turning over questions nobody else seemed to ask. Why did the pots rattle differently during high-speed maneuvers? Why did certain engine frequencies make the silverware hum? Why could he feel depth charges through his feet before he heard them with his ears? These weren't the thoughts of a cook, but Thomas had never been just a cook. Before the war, he'd worked in a Manchester factory, assembling radios. He understood frequency, resonance, how sound moved through materials. He dreamed once of becoming an engineer, but life had other plans. A sick mother, bills that wouldn't wait, dreams that faded into the practical necessity of survival. So, he learned to cook instead, joined the Merchant Navy, and eventually found himself on a Royal Navy escort vessel, feeding men who would never know his name. The U-boat threat wasn't theoretical. It was a nightmare that grew worse with every convoy. By early 1943, the Atlantic had become a graveyard. German wolf packs, coordinated groups of submarines, hunted Allied convoys with terrifying efficiency. They struck at night, using darkness as camouflage. They struck from below, where the sonar struggled to distinguish submarine from whale, wreckage from reef, and they struck in numbers, overwhelming escorts, scattering convoys, and sending ship after ship to the bottom. Thomas felt the fear even in the galley. It lived in the tightness of men's shoulders, in the way they ate without tasting, in the empty seats that appeared overnight, silent monuments to ships that never made it to the next port. He heard the whispered conversations, sonar operators frustrated by phantom contacts, captains terrified of making the wrong call, gunners firing at shadows because shadows were all they had. The technology of 1943 wasn't sophisticated. Sonar was primitive,
unreliable, more art than science. A skilled operator could sometimes distinguish a submarine's propeller signature from background ocean noise. Sometimes. But the Atlantic was never quiet. Waves crashed, engines roared, metal groaned under pressure, and somewhere in all that chaos, U-boats slipped through undetected, invisible predators waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Thomas began to notice something strange. The ship's own noise, the constant industrial symphony of engines, pumps, ventilation, and hull vibration seemed to change during convoy formations. When ships traveled close together, the acoustic environment became incredibly complex, overlapping engine frequencies, interfering sound waves, echoes bouncing between hulls. It created a kind of sonic fog, a wall of noise that might confuse anyone trying to listen.
One evening, while cleaning pots after dinner service, Thomas had an accident. He dropped a large steel pot, and it hit the deck with a tremendous clang that reverberated through the entire galley. The sound didn't just echo. It traveled, bouncing off walls, vibrating through pipes, amplifying in strange ways. Thomas stood frozen, listening. The pot's initial clang was followed by a series of secondary resonances, each slightly different in pitch and duration. The ship itself was acting like a musical instrument, and the pot had just struck the first note. Thomas picked up the pot and hit it again, deliberately this time. Then again, and again. Each strike produced the same pattern of echoes, the same traveling vibrations. His mind began racing. If he could create specific sound patterns, deliberate, controlled noise, could he change the ship's acoustic signature? Could he create false echoes that might confuse enemy sonar operators? Could noise, itself, become a weapon? The idea felt absurd even as it formed. He was a cook, not an engineer. He worked with vegetables, not acoustics. But the thought wouldn't leave him. That night, he barely slept. His mind kept returning to the physics he'd learned in the radio factory, the principles of sound propagation, interference patterns, resonance frequencies. By morning, he'd convinced himself to share the idea. He knew it would sound crazy, but ships were dying, men were drowning, and nobody else seemed to have answers. Thomas waited 3 days before approaching Lieutenant Commander Harrison, the ship's executive officer. He caught him during an off watch, when the officer was less likely to be busy. Thomas explained his observation carefully, trying to sound rational, professional. He described the pot incident, the traveling vibrations, the possibility of creating deliberate acoustic deception. Harrison listened for exactly 45 seconds before cutting him off. The officer's face went from curious to annoyed to openly contemptuous. A cook. A cook was proposing naval tactics? The absurdity was too much. Harrison didn't shout. That would have required taking Thomas seriously. Instead, he dismissed the idea with cold efficiency, the way you'd swat away an irritating insect. He told Thomas to focus on his duties, to leave naval strategy to people who actually understood it, and to never waste an officer's time with foolishness again. The words stung worse than any insult. Thomas felt his face burn with humiliation as he returned to the galley. Other crew members had witnessed the exchange. He could feel their smirks, their quiet satisfaction at seeing someone step out of line and get slapped down. That night, Thomas lay in his bunk and reconsidered everything. Maybe Harrison was right. Maybe the idea was ridiculous. Maybe he'd let the stress and fear twist his thinking into fantasy. Maybe invisibility was safer than humiliation. But then, 3 days later, the convoy lost 2 ships in a single night. Thomas heard the explosions, distant thunder that rolled across the water. He felt the ship's emergency maneuvers, the sudden acceleration, the chaotic shouting on deck. And the next morning when sailors came for breakfast, their eyes were hollow. 47 men had died in the first ship, 33 in the second. 80 names that would be added to the growing list of the Atlantic's dead. Thomas made a decision. He would test his idea himself, quietly, without permission, without recognition. If he was wrong, nobody would know. If he was right, maybe he could prove it before anyone else had to die. The testing began that afternoon. Thomas waited until the galley was empty, then started experimenting with sound. He banged pots in specific rhythms. He opened and closed steam valves to create pressure releases at calculated intervals. He moved metal pans across the deck in patterns designed to create vibration sequences. To anyone watching, he looked like a man having a breakdown, dancing with cookware while the ship sailed toward danger. But Thomas was methodical. He listened carefully to how each sound traveled. He felt for vibrations through the deck plates. He noted which frequencies seemed to carry farthest, which patterns created the most complex echoes, which combinations produced interference that might mask the ship's true acoustic signature. Over 3 days, he refined his approach. He discovered that certain steam releases, combined with rhythmic impacts on the galley's structural supports, created a cascading pattern of sound that traveled through the ship's hull like ripples across water. The pattern was random enough to seem natural, but complex enough to create confusion in the acoustic environment around the ship. It was working. He could feel it. The ship's signature was changing, becoming harder to pin down, more diffuse. But he had no way to prove it, no way to measure it, no way to convince anyone who mattered. Then fate intervened.
The convoy entered the Black Pit, the mid-Atlantic gap where air cover ended and U-boat attacks peaked. Intelligence reports warned of a wolf pack operating in the area, at least 6 submarines coordinating their assault. The convoy was a primary target, 27 merchant ships carrying food, fuel, ammunition. If the wolf pack succeeded, hundreds would die. The ship went to battle stations. Tension became physical, a pressure you could feel in your chest. Officers on the bridge stared into darkness. Sonar operators listened with desperate intensity. Gunners manned their stations, ready to fire at anything that moved. And in the galley, Thomas made a choice. He couldn't keep his experiments hidden anymore. Lives were at stake. So he did something that would have gotten him court-martialed under different circumstances. He went directly to the captain. Captain Robert Maitland was a career officer, 53 years old, exhausted by 2 years of convoy duty. He'd lost 3 ships under his watch. The weight of those deaths had carved lines into his face deeper than any ocean trench. When Thomas appeared in the captain's quarters, uninvited and unannounced, Maitland's first instinct was to have him removed. But something in Thomas's eyes stopped him. Not desperation, not fear, something else. Certainty. Thomas explained everything in 5 minutes. The pot incident, the sound patterns, the acoustic deception theory, the 3 days of secret testing. He spoke quickly, knowing he might not get a second chance. He didn't ask for approval. He simply stated what he believed, that he could change the ship's acoustic signature enough to confuse enemy sonar, but only if the captain allowed him to implement the technique during the upcoming passage through the danger zone. Maitland listened in silence. When Thomas finished, the captain asked a single question. "If you're wrong, could this make us more detectable?" Thomas answered honestly, "I don't know, sir." The silence that followed felt endless. Maitland studied Thomas's face, searching for delusion, for panic, for anything that might explain why a cook was standing in his quarters proposing experimental acoustic warfare. But what he saw was something unexpected. He saw the same haunted determination he saw in his own mirror every morning. Finally, Maitland spoke. "If I allow this, and it fails, I'll be relieved of command. If it succeeds, you'll never receive credit, because officially, it never happened. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded. "I understand, sir." Maitland made his decision. "You have 2 hours. Make it work." Thomas moved like a man possessed. He enlisted 2 junior engineers, swearing them to secrecy, and explained what he needed. They looked at him like he'd lost his mind, but followed his instructions. Together they rigged a system of steam releases connected to galley equipment, creating timed percussion sequences that would radiate through the hull. They repositioned metal cookware to act as resonators, amplifying certain frequencies while dampening others. They synchronized the ship's existing noise, engines, pumps, ventilation, into the pattern Thomas had developed. It was insane. It was improvised. It was held together by wire, prayer, and a cook's intuition about how sound moved through metal. But it was ready. The convoy entered the danger zone at dusk. Darkness fell like a curtain. The ocean became a void punctuated only by the running lights of distant ships. Sonar operators reported multiple contacts, possible submarines maneuvering into attack position. The escort commander ordered an emergency zigzag pattern. Depth charges were readied. The convoy braced for impact. In the galley, Thomas activated his system. The sound began immediately, a complex, irregular pattern of bangs, hisses, and resonant vibrations that pulsed through the ship's structure. To anyone inside the vessel, it sounded like industrial chaos, like the ship was tearing itself apart. But Thomas knew better. He could feel the pattern working,
could sense the acoustic signature fragmenting, becoming multiple overlapping sources instead of one clear target. On the bridge, Maitland listened to the strange cacophony rising from below and wondered if he just authorized the most elaborate suicide in naval history. The sonar operator looked up, confused. "Sir, our signature is changing. It's like we're 3 ships instead of 1. Maitland said nothing. He just watched the darkness and waited.
Time became elastic. Seconds stretched into hours. The convoy moved through the killing zone in agonizing slow motion. Every man aboard expected the torpedo, the impact, the explosion, the rush of cold water. But it didn't come. Minutes passed, then an hour. The sonar contacts remained but didn't close. The U-boats were circling, searching, confused. Their hydrophone operators heard something in the water. Ships, engines, propellers, but the acoustic picture made no sense. The signatures were scattered, overlapping, appearing in locations that defied geometry. Target solutions became impossible. Firing calculations couldn't resolve. The Wolfpack commander, listening to the chaos through his own hydrophones, made a decision. The convoy was using some kind of new countermeasure, something his intelligence briefings hadn't mentioned. Attacking blindly was suicide. He ordered his boats to break off, to search for clear targets elsewhere. The U-boats withdrew. Dawn arrived in shades of gray and silver. The convoy emerged from the danger zone intact. Not a single ship lost. Not a single torpedo fired. In the galley, Thomas sat on the floor, exhausted, hands shaking. He'd done it. The insane idea had worked. But he felt no triumph, only relief, and a bone-deep fatigue that came from 3 days of terror compressed into 7 hours of impossible tension. Captain Maitland came to find him an hour later. The captain stood in the doorway of the galley, looking at the cook who'd saved his ship. "It worked," Maitland said quietly. Thomas nodded. "Yes, sir. The escort commander wants to know what we did. I told him we implemented an experimental acoustic countermeasure developed by our technical staff. I didn't mention you were a cook." Thomas understood. "That's fine, sir." Maitland was quiet for a moment, then, "It's not fine, but it's necessary. If this becomes official, if the Admiralty adopts it, your name won't appear anywhere. You understand that?" "I understand, sir." "Good." Maitland turned to leave, then stopped. "Thomas, you saved a lot of lives last night. More than you'll ever know. That has to be enough." "It is, sir." And it was. Word of the mysterious acoustic success spread quietly through naval intelligence. Within weeks, technical teams were studying the phenomenon, trying to understand what HMS Starling had done. They interviewed the captain, who provided vague technical descriptions. They interviewed the engineers, who described a cook's improvised noise system with bemused confusion. They never interviewed Thomas, but they took his idea and refined it. They added science to intuition, engineering to improvisation. Within 6 months, acoustic deception became standard procedure across the Atlantic convoy routes. Ships were equipped with specialized noise generators designed to fragment their sonar signatures. Training manuals were written, officers were briefed. The technique became so routine that within a year, nobody remembered it had ever been experimental. The Battle of the Atlantic turned. Not because of one cook's idea, nothing in war is ever that simple, but the acoustic deception techniques contributed to a larger shift. U-boats found convoys harder to track, attack solutions became less reliable, the statistical advantage that had made the Atlantic a graveyard began to erode. Historians would later credit improved radar, code-breaking, air power, and escort tactics for the Allied victory in the Atlantic. They were all correct, but hidden in the margins of those victories was a contribution nobody recorded. The cook who figured out that sound itself could be a shield. Thomas Wilkins never received a medal. His name appears in no official reports. After the war, he returned to civilian life, worked in a Manchester restaurant, and told almost nobody about what he'd done. To the few who knew, he was simply Tom the Cook, a quiet man who made excellent shepherd's pie and never talked about the war. He died in 1967 at 56 from a heart attack while kneading bread dough. His obituary in the local paper was 3 sentences long. It mentioned his service in the Merchant Navy, but nothing else. No crowds attended his funeral, no military honors were rendered. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Manchester, his gravestone simple and unadorned.
But here's what the gravestone doesn't say. Somewhere in the Atlantic,
On a cold night in March 1943, a convoy of 27 ships passed through a U-boat wolf pack and emerged unscathed. 300 men who should have died went home to their families. They had children who had children who had children. Those ripples spread outward. Thousands of lives that exist because one night, in impossible circumstances, a cook refused to stay quiet. The acoustic deception techniques Thomas pioneered were used throughout the remainder of the war. Conservative estimates suggest they contributed to the successful passage of hundreds of convoys. Thousands of tons of supplies reached Britain that might have been lost. Thousands of sailors survived who might have drowned. The numbers are impossible to calculate precisely. How do you measure the value of a life not lost? How do you count the children never orphaned, the wives who didn't become widows, the parents who didn't bury sons? History loves its heroes, the brilliant scientists, the bold commanders, the men whose names echo through time. But history is also built by people it never remembers. The mechanic who fixed one crucial bolt, the radio man who decrypted one vital message, the cook who understood that sound moves through water, through steel, through the very bones of a ship, and can be bent, shaped, weaponized into something that looks like magic, but it's really just stubbornness, observation, and a refusal to accept that some problems are too big for ordinary people to solve. Thomas Wilkins never wanted to be a hero. He just wanted fewer empty chairs in the mess hall. He wanted sailors to stop dying for lack of imagination. He wanted to prove that smart ideas don't require rank, education, or permission. They just require someone willing to think differently and brave enough to speak up even when everyone tells them they're wrong. The Atlantic is quieter now. The convoys are gone. The U-boats are museums. The men who fought that battle are mostly dust and memory. But somewhere in the physics of sound, in the way navies still think about acoustic signatures, in the survival of people whose grandparents never knew how close they came to never existing, Thomas Wilkins remains. Not in the history books, not in the official records, but in the deeper truth that war reveals, that the difference between catastrophe and survival often comes down to one person, one idea, one moment of impossible courage when nobody is watching and nobody will ever know. The galley of HMS Starling was scrapped decades ago. The pots Thomas banged, the steam valves he manipulated, the metal deck plates that carried his improvised rhythms, all gone, melted down, recycled, transformed into cars and buildings and things that bear no memory of the night they saved 300 lives. But if you listen carefully, if you stand on the deck of a modern naval vessel and feel the vibrations through your feet, if you pay attention to the way sound moves through steel, if you remember that every invention starts with someone noticing what others overlook, you might hear an echo. Not of explosions or depth charges or torpedoes, but of a cook, banging pots in the darkness, turning noise into silence, turning invisibility into salvation. That echo is Thomas Wilkins. That echo is the truth history forgot to write down. That echo is the reason we're still here to tell the story.